Hi, BookTube, and welcome to a new video. It's been a while since my last one, and the reason for that is this. All 880 pages of The American People, Volume 2, The Brutality of Fact, a novel by Larry Kramer, which was published in 2020, the same year in which he died at age 85. And I think that has an impact on the type of book this is, but I'll get to that in time. So I haven't read Volume 1. Mitchell Axler, who recommended me this book, said, don't worry about reading Volume 1 first, read this. But as far as I understand, Volume 1 of The American People is a history of gay America from the Stone Age up to the Second World War, in the sense of the role that gay people have played but was omitted from the official history, or actively suppressed from the record, or even erased. And in it, Kramer sort of posits that Lincoln was gay, Alexander Hamilton was gay. And indeed, Kramer does seem to have a view that all men are gay, whether sort of out of the closet, in the closet, or totally in denial. And even if they're not gay, they have still had homosexual experiences. That's very much Kramer's take on the male of the species. So what this book is it concentrates on a very specific decade, which is the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic. Because Larry Kramer was a very active advocate during that time for the gay community, to the extent that he was, he's perceived himself as being viewed by fellow members of the gay community as the most hated gay in America. So it wasn't just the straight community and the government who hated him because of his activism and sort of, making a loud noise about it. Within his own community, he made many enemies, to the point that in this book, one of the gay characters rounds on the Larry Kramer character, who's called Fred Lemish, and sort of says, you accuse government and media of murdering gay people, but you're murdering us too, because you're making it worse for us. So I get, returning to the notion of, this book being published last year, the same year that he died, I get the sense that this is very much Kramer wanting to make sure his life was on record. Now, there's an element of self-indulgence and self-serving in that, but actually it also forms, particularly in the light of the current pandemic, it forms a really important record of the role of activism, of the role of amplification of issues and voices when those voices are not being heard. And I'll get into that more in the detail. So it is a book ostensibly about the AIDS epidemic and how particularly hard it hit the gay community in the US, in cities like New York and San Francisco, who disproportionately suffered casualties and fatalities from the disease. And Kramer puts that down to certain people in US government, in pharma, in the media, being virulently homophobic and being very happy that there was this gay plague that was seemingly wiping out homosexuals, to the point that Ronald Reagan, who in here is called Peter Royster, never mentioned the word AIDS. He wouldn't refer to homosexuals. Bush was very much the same, and Clinton, when he came to power, having made promises to the homosexual and gay communities, the only thing he enacted was to allow them to serve in the US military, and then did nothing else in the promises. So there was, very much, you could say, neglect, a spectrum either of neglect at the base minimum to overt, deliberate refusal to, send any money towards research, or to even acknowledging that, that it was disproportionately hitting the gay community. As part of that, for a long time, it was denied that women could catch HIV/AIDS. It was seen as a disease of the homosexual community. They brought it upon themselves through their sort of sexual practices, and they would just have to take the consequences of it. And of course, a sort of a side effect of saying, well, women can't catch HIV/AIDS, was that drug companies didn't see there being much profit in just trying to bring out a drug for the gay community, even though anybody could be affected by HIV/AIDS, as we all came to realise. So the farmers get a kicking in here, farmers as in pharmaceutical companies, not farmers out in fields. Pharmaceutical companies get a kicking here because they're not about sort of making the health of the nation better. They're about making profits. And indeed, everyone gets a kicking in here. So, I've talked about Reagan and Bush and Clinton. The sort of federal bodies that are responsible for the nation's health get a kicking. There's a character here called Jerry Omacedo, who is basically Anthony Fauci, who we all now love and revere, but during the AIDS crisis, he did not behave well. And Kramer had a running battle with him. And the representation of Jerry Omacedo here is someone who sat on his hands, didn't actively pursue research grants, insisted on certain standards, such as any drug trial had to sort of go for 10 years, all this sort of stuff. So Fauci does not come out well. He's not called Fauci, he's called Omacedo here, but it's pretty clear who he is. And the gay community also get a bashing from Kramer. And to be fair to Kramer bashes himself as well in this book. The gay community gets a bashing because very early on, Kramer intuited that this was spread through sexual practice and urged his fellow gay community members to not have unprotected sex, to not have multi-partners. And of course, he was rounded on by the gay community because this is the 1980s, so it's 12 years after Stonewall, where finally some rights had been won by the gay community, and the right to make love and have sex in whatever manner they chose. And they felt here was this call from Kramer was going to put them back in the closet, and that they couldn't have the type of sex, and that in a way that he was mirroring the sort of straight world line of well, gays have brought this on. These are the wages of sin and death. That gays have brought this on themselves. So that was one of the ways in which Kramer was very unpopular within his own community. Another one was that there were plenty of gay people in positions of authority. As I say, Kramer basically accuses everyone of being gay, but we'll leave that aside. But of course, such was still the sort of social stigma of it, that they were not out of the closet, at least in public. And so, when he was calling out these people to sort of stop murdering our brothers and sisters through their inaction, or their actual sort of stamping down on, or such as in the media, the New York media particularly, not reporting it, because people in the positions of power felt that if they started being sympathetic to the issue that Kramer was propounding, that it would out themselves and make it very difficult for themselves. So this is why, so for all Kramer's sort of over the top, manic, slightly crazy and surreal sort of style of the book, where he's basically accusing everybody in this sort of great anti-gay conspiracy from Reagan downwards. There's also the element of, was AIDS also, the AIDS epidemic, the perfect storm of circumstances of the fact that farmers had 10-year trial stipulations, of the fact that it just wasn't getting reported in the media and things like that. And I think, Kramer allows you to make your judgment of where it is on the spectrum. Was it outright, genocide almost, although technically gays are not a single ethnicity, of course, which is the definition of genocide, through to the sort of perfect storm of circumstances, which I think is really important when we look at the epidemic in today's terms. And again, I'll come back to that in the end. It's not a perfect book. It is so over the top in a way, and all the names are disguised. And part of the fun is trying to work out who is who. So Barbra Streisand gets a kicking because Kramer had an AIDS play which Streisand bought the rights of and was going to turn into a film. And over 10 years, she never got round to doing it. And to Kramer's increasing ire. So working out who all these people are. And, Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy, who's the real power behind the throne, because Reagan was just a stooge, really. She's called purpura in this book, and purpura is a skin disease. So it is very over the top. It is very, slapping you around the face because, as Kramer says, or what his character in here says, partway through the whole crisis, he only had two emotions left: rage and grief. Grief for all of his friends and lovers who died, and rage because they were, people were still dying in their droves and no one was doing anything about it, which is why he accuses people in authority of being murderers. So it's a sort of, in that respect, it's a bit of a cross between a sort of Don DeLillo Libra or Underworld, in that sort of massive scope, mixed with a sort of verve and irreverence and slight phantasmagoria of William Burroughs of Cities of the Red Knights. But why I think it's a really important book is the first half is the conspiracy theory half, really, very much sort of looking at the role of the White House, looking at the role of Big Pharma, looking at the role of the media and the insurance companies who were, in cahoots with the pharma companies. The fact that part of the conspiracy is how AIDS spread. That it had been around since the 1920s, but very, very sort of geographically, specifically located in the Congo, and that it was through largely through sort of American germ warfare studies, where they were sort of collecting all this blood to do these sort of germ experiments on. So you had this sort of multi-blended blood from thousands of people, which was, obviously tainted even before they did the germ warfare, because you've got 1,000 people's bloods with all the various germs and diseases that they carried all being mixed together to sort of produce a super infected blood, really. And of course this blood also became part of the product that became factor 8 that haemophiliacs were given and that was infected. And also that when sort of the Congo sort of blew up politically and there was sort of civil war and stuff, that a lot of its civil servants had been Haitians from Haiti, for reasons that I'm not clear about, but that was the case. And obviously when instability hit, they fled back to the Americas, and that they'd sort of got infected through the local prostitutes, and that sort of Haiti was the vector for it to come into America. So you've got the first vector is in the germ warfare labs. The second vector is in the sort of the Haitians bring it back both to the Caribbean but also into America, because many sort of resettled there. The third vector is Hoover ran a male whorehouse where he was basically using agents to sleep with significant influential people so that he'd have dirt over them if he required it, but also to find out secrets from them, sort of pillow talk and stuff. And so obviously there were a lot of people at a certain level of society who were sort of using this whorehouse. I mean, I don't know if it's literally one building or just the agents were trained there and then went out from there, but that was another vector of infection. So, as I say, very much the sort of conspiracy theory first part of this book, and that there was Burroughs Wellcome, one of the big pharma, who developed AZT, which was a drug that, first of all, when they brought it out to treat AIDS, it was $10,000 a shot, which nobody could really afford that. But they held the monopoly because no other drug company was given the authority to hold the trials. It was only the producers of AZT. But the head honcho of Burroughs Wellcome in here was a rampant homophobe who literally expressed the desire that he was happy for the plague to rage and kill homosexuals, even though they also produce the infected blood product factor 8, and they produce amyl nitrate poppers to help people on the social and party scene and sort of increase their libidos and stuff. So it's a sort of, again, the perfect storm of hating the people and being glad that you're killing them off, but also providing the supposed cure in AZT, but also producing something that would increase the likelihood of infection of sort of untrammeled sex through the use of amyl nitrate. So, it is quite horrific, if you veer towards the conspiracy theory side. And then you get the second part of the book, which is much more about the activism, because both in the book and in real life, Larry Kramer started up an organisation called Gay Men's Health Crisis, which has a different acronym here, which is very much sort of advice and support of gay men with AIDS. And he very quickly got frustrated because it wasn't an activist group, it was more a support and counselling kind of thing. And he realised that, you know, their voices were being ignored. No one was recognising that they were sort of being decimated by this plague. Lies were abounding, such as that women never, you know, didn't catch it. So he felt he needed to sort of create a more sort of direct action group. And in real life, it was called ACT UP. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. And the second part of this book is very much about ACT UP. So, for example, they held a stunt at a New York Mets baseball game. They did another in a cathedral. They did another one on the White House lawn where people who'd lost lovers and had them cremated threw the urns of the ashes over the fence onto the White House lawn. There was a day of action where they got into the Wall Street Stock Exchange to protest the farmers. And I wasn't quite sure where I stood on that spectrum of conspiracy theory in the first part. And I have to say the second part didn't read with nearly as much gusto and verve and energy as the second part, but I found it much more inspiring because of him talking about the activism and the specific things. And this is why I say I feel that, yes, it's very self-indulgent, that he wanted to restate everything he'd done in his life to have it on the record, but actually it's more than that, because this is a manifesto of activism, how to be activists, how, you know, what type of stunts, what attitude and mental space you need to be in to carry out these stunts. So, for example, after any event that they staged, such as, say, the White House thing, if they weren't all bundled into the back of police vans and carted off to jail, if they all got back safely, they would hold parties, they would celebrate. Not necessarily about success, but just that was the way of letting your hair down after the sort of high stakes, high tension of an illegal event. And, you know, they became family, they became comrades in arms, because they were, you know, they weren't putting their lives at risk quite so much as putting their freedom, their liberty at risk because they could get banged up. And this is something that's very current in terms of Extinction Rebellion in the UK, is how much are you prepared to go to jail for what you believe in? And it's an important question in any activism within a democratic society. So I did find that second part less enticing a read in terms of the energy, as I say, carrying me through it. It was a lot of repetition of what had gone before, but the inspirational elements of the activism I found absolutely gripping, really, for want of a better word. And in terms of, you know, today and the pandemic today, there's so many resonances. Obviously, the cure for AIDS, or at least the drug amelioration for AIDS, took a good, 15 years to find. It was incredibly expensive. And you compare that what's happened now under the pandemic, where, under a year we found the vaccines and there's a mass rollout, the whole population is going to be vaccinated. It's an absolute huge contrast with what happened under AIDS. And even then, Kramer put it down to, we need a Manhattan Project to tackle AIDS, by which he meant between 1939 and 1945, the top nuclear scientists of the day were all brought together, massively resourced, and they developed the atomic bomb in 6 years. That's what he means, that we needed that for AIDS, and because there was no political will, it never happened. Whereas here, in the pandemic, there was the political will, lots of resources were thrown at helping find a cure and rolling it out, making sure that all the citizens can be vaccinated. So that was one great contrast. Another one here is they talked about sort of contact trace, track and trace, like we were talking about with the pandemic here. But a lot of gay people refused and opposed it bitterly because they felt that that information on them about being gay would not stay within the track and trace system, but be used, go to insurance companies and all this sort of thing, and markedly affect their lives in deleterious ways. And I don't think that's quite the case. I mean, I think there are plenty of people who don't want track and trace, don't even want to be vaccinated, but I don't think it's because they fear the information is going to be used in a way against them, particularly, because there's less of a stigma about being gay, openly gay in public now. So in a way, that's one improvement. I mean, I think a lot of the opposition to track and trace and vaccination is to do with anti-vaxxers and this sort of madness. So, there was an element of that in here, that certain gay people didn't believe in a cure, or the cures that were being offered, and Kramer didn't. Kramer said AZT was useless, but people were so desperate because they knew that AIDS was a death sentence. People would sort of get bootleg drugs, they get drugs from abroad, they try anything desperately. And of course, none of this was being properly observed in a trial situation, which might have helped, because there were too many obstacles within pharma and the federal body that legalises and administers trials, medical trials, and all this sort of stuff. So a chilling book, really. First of all, it brought a lot back to me. I lived through the 80s, and I remember it was different in Britain to some extent, but equally our right-wing Conservative government would not really acknowledge it in the early years, and when it did, had these sort of really heavy-handed adverts, which just, were just appalling, really, appallingly misjudged and misguided. So first of all, as part of me, brought back part of my own. In the 80s, I would have been in my 20s. So it brought that part of my life back to me. And I have to say, the 80s is the worst decade that I've lived through. You had Thatcher and Reagan in power, you had the end of punk rock, and you had New Romanticism, you had the AIDS crisis, you had the miners' strike in the UK, which basically reopened all class wounds and divided the country, from which we've never recovered. It was just a terrible, terrible decade. You had the Heysel disaster on the football terraces. A terrible time to live, and it brought one aspect back of that. But in a way, at the time, I mean, I did a few things sort of activist-wise about AIDS. I certainly marched for Anti-Clause 28, which was you cannot in public school, in state schools, teachers cannot promote homosexuality. And that was the piece of legislation that was brought in the 80s. And I certainly marched against that. I wrote a play, although it never got produced, about AIDS and stuff. But, so while I was sort of plugged in, to then read about the activism that Kramer was involved in, just, as I say, I found it inspiring. I really was uplifted. Even though there's so much sort of death and grief in this book. And I will say, it's not a very literary book, but there were a few sections where gay men died from AIDS in the arms of their lovers. And those scenes were beautifully written. And even though the same thing was happening again and again and again, which is kind of the point, you never tired of it within the writing of this book. And in a way, it slightly reminded me of that chapter in Bolano's 2666 of the dead women in Mexico. But there I didn't care, because I just didn't feel the writing made me care. Here, I cared, because, as I say, although the book as a whole isn't terribly literary, he got to the heart of it. And in a way, his stage plays, I think, were very moving. This book is more to make you angry. As I say, you can only feel anger or grief. Angry with the authorities, grief because you're moved by the deaths. The rest of the emotional spectrum isn't really on offer in this book, but in his stage plays, such as The Normal Heart, they were on offer. And I think he drew on that when he was writing the sections here of men dying in the arms of their lovers. So there you have it. I'm just going to read you this bit. So this is a sort of he's being interviewed on TV. Why do you think New York City is being so slow to acknowledge and recognise this emergency? You're implying that the city has recognised and acknowledged this emergency, Malcolm. It has not. Why not, do you think? Because the mayor is gay and scared out of his panties it will blow his cover. The mayor being Ed Koch at the time. Not called that in this book, I hasten to say. You can't tell me what to say when I'm speaking for myself. This is the post-mortem within the Gay Men's Health Crisis organisation, and they're lambasting Fred for being so sort of out there and direct on that TV interview. You can't tell me what to say when I'm speaking for myself. Everyone knows you're one of us. You can't have it both ways. No, you cannot have it both ways. It is totally and politically incorrect to call people gay who do not self-identify as being gay. I know it's been that way forever, but something different is going on now. We're dying. I don't want to die because another gay man is too ashamed of himself to help us stay alive. I'm not going to let him kill us because he's ashamed of what I'm proudest of. If it's been commanded by the gay movement to protect such people, then it's wrong. The mayor, he's your personal friend. You want him to appoint you as a judge. Do you have a little conflict of interest going on here? So, again, you know, it's not one-sided in the sense that only the authorities and Big Pharma get blamed. Absolutely not. Kramer is critical of himself at moments where he sort of couldn't go on, you know, he just, in despair, he just sort of froze and was unable to keep, you know, for periods, unable to sort of keep at it. But he's also critical of the gay community because although rights had been won after Stonewall, and there suddenly now was this recognised thing called the gay community, it had an enormous variety within it, of course it did, and lots of different peer pressure groups within it wanting different things, and it couldn't come together in the early days of AIDS. You know, there were some gay men who carried on denying that AIDS was this sort of deadly threat hanging over their heads and carried on their behaviour, you know, completely unchecked, whereas Kramer was saying, no, you can't do that, you've got to change your behaviour. Through to, obviously, lesbians and gay men having slightly different, you know, concerns. And that's one of the reasons that he went on to form ACT UP, which kept its unity because they were a family. They were all bonded together, not only by the cause, but by their activities. And, you know, they sort of, after each event, you know, they felt so warm and loving of each other. It was, you know, it was absolutely about love, not only for the fellows that they didn't know that they were protesting on behalf of, but the ones who they were protesting with, because they were all putting themselves out there. And then it too fell apart, and there was a splinter group because a couple of the higher officials there were talking to the big pharma companies without the blessing of ACT UP, and that split the movement and stuff. But they also felt that they were possibly being penetrated by FBI and, you know, sort of moles and stuff. Again, the sort of conspiracy theory stroke paranoia coming in, because Kramer doesn't really say that they were particularly brought down by the FBI and sort of moles. He felt it was more their own internal tensions that caused them to split up and break up. So, you know, a salutary book to read during a pandemic, I have to say. Some things have improved, a lot of things haven't, and a lot of the same mistakes of not getting the information out to people, not getting people to change their behaviour by having clear messaging, sort of bureaucratic rules, things like drug tests and stuff, which in this pandemic we've waived. You know, the normal trial period has been slashed in order to get something. And maybe it's because the whole globe was vulnerable to COVID-19. But that was the point. The whole world was valuable to HIV/AIDS if it was left unchecked, if people's behaviour wasn't, you know, to be changed. But the point was that the perception was, no, it's only a select group of this community called gay, who a lot of people in government, in the moral majority of Falwell and Pat Buchanan and the electorate that Phyllis Schlafly bought, which is a sort of conservative moral right, religious moral right. You know, that there was definitely, from the highest echelons of America, an indifference at best. You know, whether it was actually more actively hostile and happy for gays to wipe themselves out as they saw it, you're going to have to come to your own conclusions on that. But a salutary read, not an easy read, but one that I was very grateful for, and I give it 5 stars. I know it's flawed, not a perfect book by any means, but just so much inspiration as well as information. You know, the stuff, some you knew, a lot you didn't. Plus the fun of trying to play the game of who is disguised by a different name from the real life situation. So there you have it. Till next time. Thanks very much.